Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Mandel JCC, Palm Beach Gardens. My name is Gail Feldman. I am the Director of Adult Programming and Trips here, and it is my pleasure to welcome you and to introduce our speaker. Paulette is very special to me because we met about 2 years ago, and she came in to talk about doing programs on a couple of the books that she has written. And of course, we got to talking. And in the course of that conversation, some things came out. And I looked at her and I said, Paulette, you have to tell your story. And she said to me, I can't, because it is too painful. And I just looked at her and I said, I understand that, but people have to know. And we sort of left it at that. And every time she would come in, I would look at her and I would say the same thing. And I said, I know it's painful, but people have to know. And this summer, she said to me, I'm ready to tell my story. So here she is, ladies and gentlemen, the incredible Miss Paulette Cooper Noble.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Lou, for videotaping it. Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? Are we okay? Okay. 1942 was a very, very bad time for Jews in Belgium. There was a tailor named Chaim Beholtz, and he got on a train, and the Nazis came, and they took him off the train, and they took him to a holding camp called Mechelen, and from there they took him to Auschwitz and killed him. He was 38 years old, and he was my father. 4 days later, I was born. My father never saw me, never knew that he'd had a little girl there. He did have a second girl, my sister Susie, who was 22 months older than I am. My mother, in October, a few months after he was taken, had to go out and get some milk. She knew it was very, very dangerous for Jews to go out then. 60% of all Jews who were caught because somebody had turned them in. And she was suspicious. They lived in a 2-story home, and she was very suspicious about the people downstairs because people were turning in Jews for the amount of money to buy a bag of sugar. So she put her 2 children, my sister and me, in a back bedroom, and she went out. And as soon as she got out, she was seized by the Nazis. And they took her to Mechelen, this holding camp, and they took her to Auschwitz, and they incinerated her. She was 31 years old. A neighbor saw my mother being seized, and he fortunately knew that she had a brother, and he knew how to reach her brother, and that was my uncle. And he called him and he said, she was taken, but there were no children with her. They must be back at the house. So this friend went, and he called up a friend of his because he knew he couldn't carry 2 little children on his own. And they went and they got us, and they brought us to an orphanage, and then they came back. But it took so long to get us and get back that they missed the curfew, and a Nazi guard was waiting. And they were smart because they decided very quickly to separate, and one went to the left and one went to the right, and the Nazi guard shot at the friend, and who was not Jewish, by the way, and hit him and took him to Auschwitz, and he later died. My sister and I were hidden in a Belgian orphanage, but we were found. And at the age of 11 months, my sister and I, we ended up in the same camp, Mechelen, ready to be sent to our deaths. I was prisoner number 843. They did not tattoo newborns. I was 1 month short of 1 year old. I was scheduled for transport number 21, and that was a cattle car because they'd stopped using passenger trains. And they were using these cattle cars with, like one mesh window. And they might have held 50 people, but they held 150 people. And they had 2 buckets, one for water and one to go to the bathroom. I don't think I would have survived the 3-day trip. I certainly would not have survived Auschwitz, because while they took the adults aside, they immediately shot the newborns and the young children because they were useless to the Germans. So on July 31st, 1943, Transport 21 left with 1,553 people, almost all Jews, almost all sent to their death. 174 children were among them, and my sister and I were not 2 of those children. And I would not know until many years later, just a few years, how I was saved. And I'm going to tell you that story later. The danger to me was not over. In 1945, towards the end of the war, Hitler decided there were too many Jewish children still left. So he ordered all the children, we were called the hidden children, all of us killed. But he was friends with Queen Beatrice of Bavaria. She was the head of, she was the big wig in in Belgium, and she was German. And she said to Hitler, do we have to kill all the children? Why don't we just kill half of them? So the Nazis stormed into the orphanage that I was in, and they went left, right, and all the children on one side were killed, and all the children on the other side were saved, and my sister Susie and I were on the side that was saved. Now, if any of you have ever been to Yad Vashem, Beatrix is one of the righteous among the nations, and that is an award they give to non-Jews who saved Jews during the war. I ended up in 4 orphanages by the time I was 6 years old. My aunt adopted my sister Susie, but she couldn't afford 2 children, and I came to America adopted by a wonderful couple named the Coopers. And the last night that I was in Belgium, I was with my sister, and my aunt said, kiss each other goodbye, girls, because you'll never see each other again. And then I came to America. I arrived on August 28, 1948, at Idlewild Airport. I was 6 years old. I was suffering from such malnutrition, I weighed 36 pounds, which is the size of a 2-year-old. I carried with me my only possession, a little ball, and I spoke only French. I wanted to become a writer from the time I was 8 years old and was able to speak English well, because I wanted my parents to be proud of me, my adopted parents. I went to Brandeis. I graduated in 3 years with honors. I studied comparative religion at Harvard for a summer. Went back to Manhattan, and I got my master's, and I am what's called a PhD. That's a PhD dropout in my last year. And I dated a lot. In 1960, a woman was expected to sleep with her date by the 3rd date. So I dated every man in New York twice. I did date a really nice Jewish guy twice, named Paul. I was 25, he was 32. He was then producing the Alan Burke Show. He had been Eleanor Roosevelt's TV producer. He had been Bishop Sheen's TV producer. But we both were very career-oriented, and nothing came of it. Anyway, I became a writer, which is what I wanted to be. And early on, I was selling to some really good places, Cosmopolitan, TV Guide, Washington Post. I was doing very well. By the age of 30, I had 4 books out. I also had a small syndicated travel column in 40 of the most obscure newspapers in America. I got a lot of free trips as a result. But one really free trip was I decided to stow away on the Leonardo da Vinci for a week in order to write about it. And I took a 1-week trip from St. Thomas, New York, St. Thomas, Puerto Rico, and back. And my theory was that they would not be looking for conspicuous stowaways. So I was very, very conspicuous. And I brought with me a black and white mix and match wardrobe, chiffon evening gown, rolled it all up, put a little rubber band at the end, got it into an attaché case, which I hid inside of a piano on a lower deck. And, I've told this story many times because I was on TV and radio and so on. And the women always asked me what I ate, and the men always asked me where I slept. But I slept by taking an empty glass of water and putting it by a couch at night so that it would look as if I had passed out. And I ate off the free buffets. And the main problem I had was that I was a single woman traveling alone, and I kept meeting men, and they wanted to escort me to my cabin, etc. And I had to come up with something because I had no cabin. So I made up a roommate who was always throwing up. I kept them out. And I did make it, and I sold worldwide rights to the Times of London, and it was optioned for a movie by Stanley Donen. No movie was made, but it was still very nice. And everything was really going fabulously well in my life. In fact, Herb, that's about when you and I met. So we have an old friend here. And I became a copywriter at BBDO. And those of you who watch Mad Men know Peggy, and that's what I was doing. And another copywriter that I knew joined Scientology, which was very, very popular at that time, in New York especially. And he told me that he thought that he was Jesus Christ after he joined. So I thought, well, I want to look into this. This is really kind of weird. Now, let me digress for a moment to tell you what is Scientology. They call themselves a church. It started by a science fiction writer named L. Ron Hubbard. It's very secretive. People pay millions of dollars. They do something called auditing, which is they confess every single thing. They reveal everything they've ever done in their lives now and in all their past lives, while holding on to a machine they call an e-meter. And they also spend a great deal of time and money talking invisible spirits out of their body. So you get somebody like John Travolta, and he's spent millions, talking these spirits out of his elbow. Why do people join? Everyone wants to know. I never did join. I just, wrote about them. Well, there's something called love bombing. Love bombing is when people are suddenly descended upon with friends and, come join us tomorrow. This is great. We love you, that kind of thing. Once they join and they've told a lot of their secrets, there's also fear. It's like they're afraid that if they leave or if they say anything, that their secrets will be revealed, and they will be, by the way. And there's also just a fear for their soul, because many of the people there sign a billion-year contract, and they feel that, all eternity, they're going to be damned if they leave Scientology or speak out. And one thing that gets them in actually is altruism, and that is they convince these people that they're going to really change and improve the world, that they have a drug program, and they're really going to help. They're just going to help bring money into Scientology, but they don't realize that. And what always troubled me, too, is how many Jews they have gotten. They've targeted Jews because they have more money generally. And I think that the Jewish religion is a very matriarchal society because we have strong mothers, and Scientology is a strong male figure. Well, once the person is sucked in, they are not allowed to have anything to do with anybody who is against Scientology. We've seen one awful example of this in recent news, and that is that Tom Cruise has not seen his daughter in 3 years because she is connected to a suppressive person. A suppressive person is somebody against Scientology. Now, another reason that they're really bad is they have an underground division to destroy critics. Now, this used to be very, very bad. Now they're watching it because the press is watching them. But I'm going to tell you what they did to me and why I call them a cross between the Moonies and the Mafia. In 1971, my first book came out. It was called The Scandal of Scientology. You can still read it today free on my website, paulettecooper.com. I call it the book that launched 1,000 suits. How many of you saw the HBO documentary Going Clear? Okay, a few of you did. If it comes up, do see it. It's really absolutely wonderful. Well, in the 70s, I was the only one to speak out against them. And for 15 years, I was the point person if anyone had problems with Scientology. and everyone who had ever been in there practically did. And believe it or not, there was a time there was no internet. I was the internet, okay? If a lawyer needed a witness, I knew somebody that could help them. If a reporter was doing a story, I knew of a local person to give them the angle so they could run the story. I was also the only one who would talk on radio or TV against them. Well, they sued me all over the world 19 times. I had to support these suits. I was deposed for an aggregate of 50 days. The harassment of me, though, was more than just legal. This underground intelligence division I was telling you about, they wrote my phone number on bathroom walls, men's bathroom walls all over the city, so I would get these horrible phone calls. My phone was tapped. There appeared to be a couple of possible attempts to murder me. A member who left wrote an affidavit saying that she'd been at a meeting discussing ways to kill me. And I was scared, fighting them. I really was. But I felt that they were a very fascistic organization, and that because of what had happened to my parents, I really couldn't quit. And I also felt that in 1939 and so on, if people had spoken out, a lot of these things wouldn't have happened to people like my parents and the Jews. So I felt I had to speak out against this evil fascistic organization. But I was especially scared after a somewhat mysterious murder attempt. I was living in New York on a ground floor apartment. My second cousin was there, and there was a flower delivery, and she opened up the door, and the person unwrapped a well-dressed person, by the way, unwrapped the flowers and took a gun out and put it to her temple, and she managed to scream, and some doors opened, and he ran out. So at that point, I thought, I'm going to move to a very safe place, with a doorman. And I moved to a building called the Churchill at 39th and 2nd, a beautiful place, swimming pool on the roof, was my dream apartment, and I really felt safe. Well, there were 300 tenants in there. I was living there maybe 2 weeks, and they all received this horrible anonymous smear letter about a woman who had moved into the building, and they called me a part-time prostitute with venereal disease, and they said I had sexually molested a 2-year-old baby girl. I kidded my friends. I said 22-year-old baby boy, baby, but and that was one of many, many anonymous mailings over the years. Somehow they found my diary in the back of my closet. And, at 17, I wrote one day, I'm so angry at my mother and father. So they underlined that and sent it to them. And they sent my parents a letter saying I was practicing sexual perversions with their rabbi, which I never went to temple. I don't know how I could have possibly even have met him. But the worst thing is that I got a visit from 2 FBI agents one day, and they said that Scientology had received bomb threats and named me as a likely suspect. Well, they had so many real enemies that I instantly knew the whole thing was nonsense. But I was called before a grand jury. I didn't even bother getting a lawyer. And the letters, the bomb threats, were absolutely ridiculous. They were obviously an attempt to frame me. They referred to books. They referred to Hitler. They said, must be destroyed. It was an obvious frame-up. I couldn't figure out why the prosecutor was taking this seriously, and he kept saying to me again and again, did you ever see this letter before? Did you ever touch this letter before? There were 2 letters, actually. And then came the bombshell. He said, well, if you've never seen these letters and you never touched them, would you please explain to the grand jurors how your fingerprint got on one of them? And at that point, I knew that my life was over. I spent 8 of the most horrible, horrible months of my life. This was during the Watergate hearings. I was indicted. I was arrested. I faced 15 years in jail, $15,000 in fines. I was on probation. I couldn't leave the state, couldn't visit my folks down here. I couldn't even go to New Jersey, although why I would want to, I don't know. My legal fees were $28,000. That would be like $75,000 today. And the government tried to make a deal with me. They said, look, if you go back before the grand jury and say that you did it, we will drop the charges and that will be it forever. But I didn't want to do it because I didn't do it. And where was I going to get the money, though? And I couldn't write, of course, during all of this. So I called my parents. They lived in Oriental Point, Mamaroneck. And I told Dad the situation, and he was cool. He said, look, he said, we'll support you no matter what, because we don't want you to go and perjure yourself before a grand jury to save us money. And he said, but just out of curiosity, because this is going to cost us a lot of money, I can tell, did you do it? And I said, Dad, I have lied to you about little things in the past. Whenever the guy I was dating was not Jewish, I used to say he was half Jewish. I said, but this is serious, and I promise you, I did not do it. So, anyway, besides my fear of jail during this time, which was a real fear, this was a terrorist crime. They treated these things very seriously then and now. I was terrified this was going to hit the papers. I was photogenic, you'll see from the photos of me. I was photogenic, I was single. This was 1973, I was traveling around the world instead of being married and having children. And it was a bizarre story. A woman writes about a church and then sends them bomb threats. So I knew that I was just going to be ruined. No editor would ever give me an assignment again. Everything I'd ever done would be in the papers. Everyone I'd ever known was going to read this. The lawyers said I had a 95% chance of conviction with fingerprint. And the worst thing to me was that the lawyers said that my parents would have to sit in the front row throughout the entire trial because they felt the one thing that might save me is that the jurors would like me only because I liked my parents. So just to do that to them was devastating. And for 8 months, the anxiety was so terrible. You could taste it in my throat all the time. I couldn't sleep. I would fall asleep for 10 minutes and just wake up in icy terror. All I could eat were 2 eggs and tomato juice, vodka, yes, and Valium. And I went down to 83 pounds just from not eating. And I was obsessed with how did they get my fingerprint on this? And I just couldn't work. I became totally agoraphobic. I could not leave the house. And a guy I met platonically, Jerry Levin, offered to move in, pay half the rent, and walk the dog. And he got me out to the roof a few evenings because I was just holed up. I wouldn't go out at all. But it just nothing worked. I started saving Valium for the night before the trial. I had decided that I was just not going to put my parents through this or myself. And on my 31st birthday, I faced jail, humiliation, and ruin. The guy I had been dating for at least a year, Bob, and we were talking marriage, had left me saying I was no fun anymore, which I was not. And I was alone on my 31st birthday. And my 4th book had come out that day. It was called The Medical Detectives. And it was the first book on forensic medicine for the layman. It's now CSI. It's very popular now, but it was considered morbid then. They thought that it was about death, So the first review came out that day on my birthday, and it was a bad review. Eventually, the book won the Edgar Allan Poe Award, but today it would be #1, CSI. But in those days, So I got very drunk that night, and I just started taking the pills, and I decided the drunker I got, the easier it would be to just take the entire bottle. And an old Brandeis friend called me, and she kept me on the phone until I just about passed out, and that was it. And I did attempt to take lie detector tests to prove my innocence, but everybody can't be tested, especially if you're tremendously stressed. And I couldn't even pass the control question, so we couldn't do anything with that. So I decided I was going to take a truth serum test, sodium mannitol. And no doctor wanted to do it because I was 83 pounds. Hi, Simon. I was 83 pounds. I was in very bad health. The anesthesia alone could kill me, which didn't bother me. I planned to kill myself anyway. But finally, we found a doctor from Mount Sinai who agreed to do it. And after several hours of questioning, he became convinced that I hadn't done it and that he would testify. And the government backed off and said, well, we won't we'll wait a year for the trial. If there's no more bomb threats, we'll drop it. And meanwhile, go to a psychiatrist just in case you did it, get it out of your system. So for over actually 5 years, I had this over my head, worrying that the Scientologists were going to send more bomb threats once they realized that I had not been arrested, that my secret would come out at any moment and ruin my career. Meanwhile, they kept piling on the lawsuits and the harassment, and I was just totally obsessed with how this had all happened and proving my innocence. In 1978, I was coming back from a travel writing assignment in Europe, and I don't know if you remember, but they used to give out free Herald Tribunes on the plane. And I pick up the paper, and my God, I am the headline. And the story is that when FBI had raided Scientology a couple of years earlier, they found that seized Scientology paper indicate writer was framed. So I was so happy, I just started crying on the plane. And as soon as I got off the plane, I called Bob, figuring I could get him back at this point. And what I didn't know was that Scientology, a few years earlier, had sent his boss an anonymous letter written as if I had written it, containing information he thought was known only to me. And he wrote a letter basically accusing me of everything, sending the bomb threats, and said he never wanted to hear of me or from me again. Well, I had to wait 3 more years to finally see the documents that proved that I was framed. And there were a lot of weekly harassment, what they were doing to me every week. And they kept saying, Miss Lovely this, Miss Lovely that. And then it didn't take long to realize that Miss Lovely was their sarcastic name for me. And then there was what the lawyers would call the money line, in which they admitted that they had conspired to frame Miss Lovely for a crime she did not commit. They also apparently tried to do it again in 1976, which I didn't even know about. And that was 3 years after my arrest. And it was called Operation Freakout. And this time they were going to pose as me and threaten to bomb stores, send bomb threats to Henry Kissinger in my name. Cute. From that, I learned how they had gotten my fingerprint without my ever seeing the piece of paper. Right before the first bomb threat was sent, they sent it to themselves, of course, a woman had come into the apartment to ask me to sign a United Farm Worker petition. They were very big in those days. You remember that, Cesar Chavez and so on? And it was hot, and she wore gloves, and there was a clipboard. And they had pasted the clipboard, the bomb threat, or the blank paper that they later wrote the bomb threat on, underneath the clipboard. And that is how this part of my finger, was just a quarter of a finger, third finger, holding the clipboard, how it had happened. Now, I also learned something else that was quite distressing. This guy that I was living with, Jerry, and he would go upstairs, as I said, every night to the roof, and he would try to get me to go there also. And a few times I did. And he would jump up on the ledge and say, come on up, how are you going to fight these bastards if you don't even have the guts to come up here? And thank God I was in such a terrible state that I would not go up there. Well, it turned out that Jerry was a Scientologist, and he had been sent by them. In fact, Jerry Levin is not even his name. And he was calling in daily diaries of what I was doing, what was happening with the case. In fact, I read today she's talking suicide. Wouldn't that be great for Scientology? He wrote. He's the one who found my teenage diary, and they sent it. He's the one who knew about things about Bob that Bob thought that I had done. And so sometimes I think, my God, if I had gone up on that ledge, I don't know. I was talking suicide. Everybody would have thought that I'd commit suicide. So, anyway. Seeing the documents hardly ended the harassment. It went on and on. I was somewhat publicly exonerated when I was on 60 Minutes. I did counterclaim. They worked harder to get me to drop my suit, so there was more harassment. They also robbed my psychiatrist's office and sent those records to people. We're not dealing with nice people. Finally, in 1985, others were speaking out against them, and I felt I could live my own life, and I left the field of fighting them, no longer a crusader. A year later, I was at a birthday party, and the first person I bumped into was Paul Noble, that guy that I had met years earlier, 19 years earlier. And he had gone on to produce Midday Live, win 5 Emmys, bring Dr. Ruth and Matt Lauer to TV in New York. And by that point, I'd written 12 books. Neither of us had married. And 1 year after we saw each other again, May 17th, I was 45, he was 52, and we were the oldest first-time bride and groom that we knew of. We had spent 97 years single together. By the way, Dr. Ruth was one of our wedding guests. And we went on our honeymoon on the QE2. I left the Churchill, moved to Paul's place in the East 70s. In 1991 was the Gulf War. My sister, who'd been adopted by my aunt and uncle, had married, and she'd moved to Israel, and she'd become a widow. So I was worried there was going to be a second Holocaust there, so I brought her over to America. I had purchased the Churchill apartment when I was living with Paul. I set her up in New York. She became a saleswoman at Saks Fifth Avenue. Now let's see, Paul and I, we're going to have our 28th wedding anniversary coming up. We live at Ibis Island, Palm Beach, with 2 teacup Shih Tzus, Peekaboo and Polo. I still write books. I'm up to 22 with 8 writing awards. Wikipedia says my books have sold 500,000 copies, but that doesn't include Scientology, which probably has been read free by unbelievable amounts. And I never made a dime. And I hope that's not true for my next one. Was Elvis Jewish? Plus hundreds of amazing and amusing anecdotes no rabbi ever told you. 11 years ago, we moved to Palm Beach, and Paul retired. He'd spent 11 years acquiring movies at Lifetime Television. We moved next door to my parents' condo. They were 95 years old. They'd been married 68 years. We knew that at that age, that one of them was going to lose the other, and they would need us. So my mother died a year later, and for the next 4 years, Paul and I had breakfast every single day with Dad, and often dinner. And he lived to 99 3/4. Yeah, and in good mental health, and was buried at Eternal Life in Boynton, where Danny, my brother-in-law, and Paul's mother's also buried. I write a column for the Palm Beach Daily News on pets, and Paul takes the photos. I also have a series of books that are somewhat popular on all the consignment vintage thrift shopping. And by the way, if anyone wants to buy one of those, they're generally 18, but I'll sell it to you for 10. Paul and I lecture all over the county, me on my books and Paul on film. And every week I get, just about every week, an email from someone who left Scientology years ago because of me. It's really nice. And I am still involved in the anti-Scientology movement. And we have, when I wrote about them, there were 100,000, and now there's 20,000, maybe even 10. But I won't be happy until it's 1. I'm going to allow them 1 Meshuggah, that's it, okay? No more. And a lot of the reason that they're doing so badly today is because of a wonderful guy named Tony Ortega. He's the former editor of the Village Voice, and every day he writes an expose of Scientology. If you're interested in the subject, it's tonyortega.org, okay? And he wrote about me in the Village Voice 3 years ago, and that became expanded into a book called The Unbreakable Miss Lovely, and you can also buy that. And the photo of me was when I was 29 years old, when all these terrible things happened. And it's a great story, I just wish it wasn't mine. So Tony wrote a story about me, it was the 40th anniversary of my book having come out. And he wrote this story, and he mentioned in the story in the Village Voice that I was in Belgium and my background. And the paper got picked up, the story got picked up by the biggest newspaper in Belgium and Holland. And I got an email from a man named Peter DeHoe. And he asked me a lot of questions, but he also seemed to know a lot of things. And he said, there was one thing that was way off, I thought. He said, was your father, Chaim Beholtz, a leather worker? And I said, no. But I called Susie the next morning, and I said, wasn't our father a tailor? And she said, yes, he specialized in leather. So what I found out was that Peter DeHoe's father and my father were best friends back in the 30s when they were in the Navy. And when his father, who'd become a very, very high-ranking person in Holland during the war, found out that the two children of his former best friend were about to be sent to Auschwitz, he had inherited a house, and he sold the house for 60,000 guilders, which is like 100 grand. And they bribed a notoriously venal guard named Philip Schmidt, and that's him with his dog Lump, which he used to sick on people. And Schmidt took the bribe, and when the 21st transport left, Susie and I were not on it. So my father never lived long enough to learn that because of his old friend, Peter DeHoe's father, he would have two girls who would live past 70, that one would become sort of a successful writer and later happy in life. And Susie would have two children, a boy named Chaim after our father, and a girl named Rachel after our mother, and that they would give him 6 grandchildren. So while Hitler killed 2 of us, 8 of us survived today. Now, 2 quick endings to the story, and that is that in 1930, my father gave a gift to his old buddy, Peter DeHoe's father, of a handcrafted leather book jacket. And you'll see it even says CB at the bottom, my father's initials. Peter mailed it to me last year. And it's my most precious possession. Someone said to me, a friend, oh, why don't you bring it and show it tonight? I said, no, it never leaves the house. My father never had a grave, and this is the one thing that is left of him. Peter and I corresponded for 3 years after we first, after he first wrote me. And last summer, Paul and I sailed on the Queen Mary, and he flew to meet me in London. He's half Jewish, by the way. His father, who saved me, was not Jewish. It's his mother who's Jewish. And he's a retired banker. And he's just absolutely fabulous guy. We spent 11 hours together. And the trip for me was great closure, where I finally solved the mystery of my early life. And also for him, I think it was very good, because he wrote me that he loved Paul and me, and that it was the most valuable day of his life, because he saw that his father had done something very positive in saving me. Now, just in conclusion, I sometimes ask myself, what if? We almost do this, where there are certain things have happened in our lives. And I say to myself, well, what if? What if my father hadn't been taken and my mother didn't have to fend for herself? And, what if the neighbor hadn't seen her when she was taken and we were saved? And what if Queen Beatrix had said, no, just, kill all the children? And there's so many. And what if I hadn't gone to the party the night that I met Paul and wasn't going to go out? And what if I had gotten up on that ledge, with Jerry? There's so many what-ifs in my life that sometimes I say to myself, well, why? Why did this all happen the way it did? Now, I imagine most of you know the meaning of the word beshert, right? Okay, so I say to myself, maybe it was all beshert. Maybe this was all destined to happen to me exactly the way it happened. And then sometimes I think maybe it was just luck, The right person was at the right place at the right time. And then sometimes I think, well, maybe there was a God up above who looked down at this tiny little orphan and said, I want her to live. And here I am. Thank you.
From the little I know about Scientology,
Yeah.
they do believe, I believe,
Yeah.
that they believe in extraterrestraal life that
Yes.
have come here
Yes,
to, and that are,
that's right, yes.
that they are.
Right, I didn't explain that when John Travolta is talking the spirits out of his, when John Travolta is talking the spirits out of his elbow, those spirits came from another planet ruled by an evil prince named Zendel. Okay.
How did you re-meet your sister?
Actually, I had stayed in touch with her over the years. My parents, adopted parents, almost adopted her also at one point, but they didn't. And we corresponded, and then I saw her again for the first time when I was, I think, 17. So, yeah.
Could you possibly be the youngest survivor of the Holocaust?
No, I think, well, 1942. I don't think so. There's a very large community. I was surprised. I was asked, in fact, recently, I thought she was coming. Is she here? Joy? No? Oh, there. Hi, Joy. I should have recognized you. About that there is a group with the Jewish Albert Family Services that helps Holocaust survivors. And she wanted to know if I wanted to meet. And I said no. Because at this moment, I'm not involved. I can do a few speeches, but as you could tell, I get upset over it all. So, yes.
Thank you for your brilliant presentation, Paulette. Steven Spielberg made a documentary with as many cases as he could get, and that's on display, if I'm not mistaken, at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. Are you in that? And if you're not, how can we get you in it?
No, it's the Shoah Foundation, and in fact, they are no longer taking, because somebody, when I did speak, wanted to, to get me in, and they looked into it, and they're finished on that. So, anything else? Yes, way in the back. I'm sorry.
How did your adoptive parents arrange your adoption?
Again, we're talking about the what ifs and the flukes in life, because I was actually supposed to be adopted by a psychiatrist couple in Philadelphia, and my mother was at a party. She met this woman, and they got along well. And the woman said, do you have children? And my mother said, no, we're trying to adopt, but we're too old. They were 33, I think, at that time. Yeah. And so she said, well, my brother-in-law runs an orphanage in Belgium, and there's a real cute little kid named Paulette, but she's supposed to go to a psychiatrist couple, and you know how Michelle they are. Let us see what we can do. And they fooled around with the papers, and I was, you get certain ideas at certain times. When I was on 60 Minutes, I was thinking to myself, there's two people out there who are probably watching, because it's a very popular show at that time, and they have no idea that I was supposed to be their daughter.